Hello and welcome to Connected by Controversy. I'm your host, Chris White. Today we'll be talking about the drug war in Mexico. Professor Benjamin T. Smith is a historian specializing in Mexico at the University of Warwick, and he's written a number of books on controversial subjects in Mexican history, actually, and his latest details one of the most controversial, if not the most controversial of all right now, and that's the drug war. This has unfortunately been the main press topic in Mexico over the past 15 or so years, ever since President Felipe Calderón declared the war on the cartels. The violence has spiraled out of control ever since. And as Professor Smith notes in his book, it hasn't always been like this, even though there's been an incredibly long history of drug production and trafficking in Mexico. I can attest to this change as well because I spent my junior year in Mexico from 1990 to 91, and it was quite safe, even though there was drug trafficking back then. I've been back many times between then and now, and oftentimes taking students and even family members down there. And we mainly traveled on the Mexico City to Veracruz highway region because I spent most of my time in Veracruz and Mexico City. But it wasn't until December of 2007 that I noticed a huge change. Roadblocks, military checkpoints, shootouts took place near the Palenque ruins, in fact, where I had my class at the time. We were staying at a hotel nearby there. And since then, I haven't taken any students back to Mexico. I've actually taken them to El Salvador and Nicaragua and Honduras, but not back to Mexico. I've gone back, taken my father one time, but for the most part, I just kind of go on my own, and I go to places where I have most contact, which is in Veracruz, the state of Veracruz, which has become one of the hot spots for violence between several cartels in the past few years. Professor Smith's new book is called The Dope, The Real History of the Mexican Drug Trade. Welcome to the show.
Cheers. Thanks a lot, Chris.
I really have enjoyed this book. And as I understand it, you also have strong connections to Mexico. How did you get started going there?
Well, I think probably like so many kind of young students, I went there initially really for the politics. I mean, this was the late 1990s, and frankly, politics in Britain was fairly boring. So as a result, I kind of went off as a slightly naive early 20-something, thinking I would lend my completely inconsiderable, my completely useless skills to the Zapatistas or something like that. I clearly didn't, but I did fall in love with Mexico, and went there kind of a couple of times in the late 90s, early 2000s, until I finally stumbled into a journalistic job out there, which was for the Financial Times, which I lost within about 2 weeks of gaining. And as a result, like many other down at heel former students, I just basically taught English for about a year. But I did kind of gain a huge kind of love for the country and love for the people, and went back to university, to Cambridge, to go and study a PhD on the history of Mexico. So that was my kind of slightly strange and circuitous way in. I suppose what attracted me, was the politics, was the Zapatistas. It was also, I suppose, I had a slightly kind of romanticized vision of Mexico through the eyes of people like Malcolm Lowry, who was a kind of slight alcoholic British author who rocked up in Mexico in the 1930s. I had a kind of sneaking respect for Graham Greene's Whiskey Priest. You don't really meant to say that, but so there were kind of as well kind of literary precursors to, or literary interests I had as well.
Sure, I can understand that. And by chance, have you run in the same circles as Young Grillo?
I have, yeah. I get on very well with Yo, and his second book, Gangster Warlords, he came over and did a little tour around here, and I was very lucky enough to, well, basically kind of drive him round from university to university. So yeah, he's a fascinating guy and a brilliant journalist.
Definitely, and it seems like you all arrived there around the same time, late 1990s, and to do the same kind of thing too. Right?
Yes, yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, there's a strangely kind of strong core of Brits. I mean, the second thing to bear in mind is two of the big, I suppose, historians of Mexico and English language historians of Mexico. Alan Knight was at Oxford and David Brading was at Cambridge. And I think people kind of presume that I worked with Alan. I didn't. I worked entirely with David Brading. But there's quite a few people who came through that track. So you've got Tom Rath at London, Nat Morris, Paul Gillingham, and even Matthew Butler at UT Austin. So there were quite a lot of Brits who kind of got into this in that era.
Huh. And Yoan talks about being inspired by the Oliver Stone film Salvador, wanting to become kind of a wartime correspondent. Did that movie have an effect on you too?
No, that's because Yoan is noticeably much older than me, clearly.
Ah, right.
no, I mean, so I'm being rude there.
Sure.
No, I mean, it was I confess it was much more, the Zapatistas were just an enormously exciting, I mean, you remember them, I'm sure yourselves, if you'd gone there as early as 91. But their kind of explosion onto the world stage, and then they went on the Zappa tour, and I was lucky to kind of see them in the Oaxaca Zocalo with my now wife. I mean, it was a enormously kind of exciting event, right? I mean, this was something, and so novel and new, and trying to marry old school Marxism, Marxist Leninism with kind of new school identity politics, and incredibly kind of witty and sophisticated leader. I mean, it was a former academic. So look, we can be exciting. So it was a real joy. Yeah, I mean, it was enormously innovating, right? I'm sure about half Latin American academics got into it, or of my age got into it because of the Zapatistas. Sure. You didn't get into it because of Vicente Fox.
Right, that's a good point. Yeah, I was actually in Orizaba, Veracruz on when the Zapatista uprising took place. Saw it on a television screen with a bunch of other people in a taqueria, and we didn't really understand what was going on. And I think most Mexicans took them a long time before it did. But yeah, Marcos and the Zapatistas really kind of ignited our imagination, people from that generation. And later on, I went back and saw Salvador, and then kind of put the two together, and really got that. Sparked a lot of my interest in Central America too.
I'm surprised that you've taken student. I mean, the story that you tell of having to kind of stop going to Mexico with your students is extremely sad. We have to do exactly the same at Warwick. We had some kind of robberies of some of our students who were doing study abroads there, so we had to basically ban them going to Mexico. But I'm very surprised that your university still allows you to take people to El Salvador and Guatemala. I mean, that's right. That's really good and open-minded of you.
Well, and I should say that those trips actually, the last one was in 2011. So, so I was taking them, I guess, after the Mexico trips, but I ended up stopping that too, partly because the interest actually in those trips kind of went down, maybe for a variety of reasons. I'm not exactly sure. I blame it on smartphones myself. People were spending their time on the smartphones and weren't as interested in traveling. And I would take students down, and they would be on their smartphones. In 2011, we went to the 30th anniversary of the Massacre del Mozote, actually, and
wow,
that was that was the case. So I kind of lost a lot of my interest in taking students too.
No, right, okay, that's interesting. I mean, I'm wondering. We lived. I mean, I think we were unbelievably fortunate, people who were living in the 1990s, to live through this kind of golden age where it was relatively, I mean, you could go to a newly opened kind of Eastern Bloc, Russia, bits of Asia you hadn't been able to go to before, bits of Latin America even, right? And also these places were relatively safe. So the kind of criminal wars that you've seen kind of escalate over the last decade or 2 decades really in places like Rio or Mexico or El Salvador weren't really going on there. Homicide rates were going down, right? During that era. And although, you can kind of get into trouble. I mean, nowadays I had students that have gone on study abroads to kind of Honduras or Brazil that I've talked to. I mean, they all have relatively kind of hair-raising stories that I'm pretty sure I was very fortuitous. I didn't have when I first went out there.
Definitely. Yeah, I agree. It's really unfortunate that it's become that way. And what's really great, I think, is even though there have been a number of books written about the drug war in Mexico, and you mention a bunch of them in your book too. I'm so glad you mentioned Isaac Campos, for example. A lot of people, don't really know about his work. It's very, scholarly, of course, but the popular audience is where it really needs to get to. But you're going back to that period of time and then tracing it all the way forward, as opposed to just looking at El Chapo. That's the only person people know about, right?
Right.
And they watch Narcos and they learn about a lot of these other names too, which is good. But as you point out, even in Narcos, and they're trying to get into a lot of the details, they're skipping over a lot of stuff, and they're also conflating, and they're changing the real history. And so your book does a great job of correcting this and showing this deep history.
Oh, yeah, thank you very much. I mean, Narcos was kind of coming out when I was producing this book. So, I mean, and you're right, it does try to kind of fill in more details, but it takes it from an incredibly kind of pro DEA point of view. And particularly the last the last series I found to be, I mean, it was effectively saying the DEA went down there and they tortured and murdered people in order to find Camarena's supposed killers.
Yeah.
I mean, it was an open admittance, as far as I could make out, that the DEA allowed torture and encouraged torture among its agents. I mean, I thought it was a kind of amazing piece of kind of confession in a way, but then no one took it like that. But because it's so ingrained in our minds that drug traffickers have it coming, right? That they deserve this kind of brutal treatment because they're nasty, immoral individuals. So we completely accept it. But I mean, it's a very, that fourth series is very, very strange in a way, because it does, as I say, just has the DEA going around and murdering Mexicans.
Yeah, and I have actually a colleague who focuses on Appalachian history here, West Virginia history in particular. And every time a new episode that he'd watch a new episode, he'd come in and say, "Wait, who's this guy they're talking about, and what's the connection? Why does the DEA care about him?" And so I give him a talk, and he'd say, this is because he basically showed that there's a lot of interest, a lot of popular interest in these people and in the role of the United States down there, and that's why Narcos has to do, I think, a better job of being more holistic, like looking into the Hector Berreyes story. They don't even mention him in that third season, but that's what he's investigating.
Although I think Hector is effectively the model for that person, for the main character, for the Bresnan character. I mean, I think that he's a compound of various other DEA officers, but effectively he's Berreyes. He's kind of also a bit Phil Jordan, who is another Hispanic DEA agent who went down in the 1990s and did, I suspect, some fairly off the books kind of things. Yeah, I mean, I interviewed a lot of these people for the book, and I think the one thing that really surprised me was quite how upfront they were about the use of violence and torture. I found that really quite disturbing. I mean, a lot of them, frankly, were alcoholics. By the time I'd met them, they were beaten up. They were beating themselves up over it. Some of them were kind of deep believers that some of them would end their emails to me in kind of with kind of Trump build the wall kind of sentiments, because they'd gone down there and they thought that Mexico was the most dreadful place in the world where they saw these kind of frightening things. But most of them, as I say, were Hispanic Americans or Mexican Americans who got into the DEA probably because one of their relatives or their neighborhood had been taken over by heroin or cocaine in the 1970s and 80s. And then all they had really done, they realized, is put a lot of people who looked like them in jail and brutalized them. So there was, talking to these people, you get a sense there's a lot of pain there.
Sure. And it's like, it's almost like a schoolyard fight, where you have to keep answering the violence with the violence. And a lot of what happens in a schoolyard is actually the result of the administrators putting people into a box and making them behave a certain way. And you really portray this very well in the book by showing how, kind of like they do in Narcos too, that once you see that law enforcement pressure coming down, then the people who are involved in the trafficking, they start behaving differently, whereas they were authorized to do it before, then they have to behave differently. And it's also, the law is not applied equally to each of the traffickers tut. Can you talk about some of these examples going back in history?
Yeah, so this really struck me, is that I mean, there seemed to be a kind of eternal law of drug policing, which is the harder you do drug policing, the more you put people, the more you threaten people with years in prison or with torture or with the kind of torture of their family members, the more likely they are to respond with violence, right? So you saw it again, you particularly saw it during the 1970s, when Nixon announced his so-called war on drugs, which frankly in the United States didn't really get going until the Reagan era, right? I mean, mass incarceration doesn't actually really get going until kind of 82, 83, 84. But in Mexico, the war on drugs is fought as a genuine war. They send 10,000 soldiers into the countryside, and they shoot peasants, torture peasants, and the peasants themselves shoot back. And people becoming increasingly paranoid. And one thing I think that is not fully understood about drug policing is quite how prevalent the use of informers is. So one of the things that I found out of talking to these DEA agents is all of them used multiple different informers. And these informers had a very, very, very short shelf life, right? Most of the DEA agents who were there for about a year said they'd lost between a dozen and 20 informants every year, right? So effectively what a DEA officer's job was to find a network of drug dealers, find an informant, put pressure on that informant, make him turn on his allies, and hopefully arrest them before they killed him, right? So that was effectively, so you're very deliberately dividing these networks against one another. And then they had a term for it, right? It was called divide and conquer. That's how they effectively do this. So often nowadays we see on the news, this cartel is fighting that cartel, right? The Zetas against the Gulf cartel, or it's the Sinaloans against the Beltran Levas. But in a lot of these occasions, it's the DEA that have deliberately engineered this division and set these cartels against one another. And they often have informants in one of these cartels that are telling them, I mean, they clearly had an informant in Chapo's organization, might well have been Chapo himself, who was ratting out all the Beltran Levas in the kind of late 2000s, early 2010s, right? So a lot of these cartel divisions, as I say, are engineered by the drug police. So I think that was a real shock to me. My assumption was that cartels were kind of naturally competitive capitalist enterprises that would naturally fight one another, but they kind of weren't.
Sure, and we can see that change by going further back in time when they weren't fighting. Was there a time when they were dealing drugs and there wasn't violence?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much throughout most of the 20th century, really. I mean, until Nixon pushes this militarized war on drugs in the early, or particularly violent policing of the war on drugs during the early 1970s, and there's something called Operation Condor in 75. It is relatively pacific. In actual fact, yeah, there is very, very little violence that is meted out either towards drug traffickers or by drug traffickers to the general population or to the police. I mean, you can count the number of murders connected to the drug trade on the fingers of two hands, right? I mean, there's very, very few murders until the 1970s. And even in the early 1980s, the drug trade becomes, again, fairly pacific, basically because the Mexicans tell the DEA to get out of Mexico in about 1979. Well, they don't say get out, but they say don't police here anymore. So from 79 to 85, again, it's relatively pacific. These things, I mean, relatively, it is accelerating somewhat. But yeah, no. So as I say, pre-1970, Mexico was still producing pretty much all America's marijuana, and certainly 20, maybe 30% of its heroin. And the drug trade was, the drug trade itself in Mexico, at least, was killing no one.
And that's something that people just cannot really fathom, I think. And even in Mexico today, if you talk to some people, at least they'll say, well, maybe we can do something different, like we can legalize drugs, but we can't do this abrazos no balazos, right? You can't do the hugs not drugs thing, where it's like they can't give up on the idea that these are bad people, therefore they still need to be punished. And because of all of the violence that's already taken place, a couple 100,000 murders in the past decade and a half at least, and so it seems very difficult for people to get past that. Even if you learn the history, how do you apply those historical lessons to the present?
Well, I think Yeah, I mean, it is obviously fascinating to talk to Mexicans about this, and clearly, and this is something that Isaac has really brought out. There is a very, very strong kind of anti-drugs feeling in most of Mexican society. So they I mean, and as Isaac has shown, basically they believe that if you smoke marijuana, you behave in a violent and criminal. You will behave in a violent and criminal fashion. And still to this day, a lot of Mexicans believe that. I think in actual fact, in terms of when they take surveys of people who want criminal legalization of marijuana, I think Mexico is one of the kind of lowest desires for legalization of marijuana in the world, right? America has a much more developed, sophisticated, liberal idea about marijuana. So you're absolutely right. Mexicans have held these kind of ideas too, but also I think it's something that I want to do at the end of the book is try to extricate two things that are happening in Mexico. One is the drug trade, right? And the drug trade is effectively growing stuff, transporting it to a border place, and then transporting it over the border, right? It doesn't actually intrinsically involve any violence, right?
Right.
There is something else that is going on in Mexico, which is effectively criminal groups are now running what I call in the book protection rackets. They're effectively acting like the Sicilian mafia. They're going to they started off going to illicit businesses in the 1990s. So carjackers, pirate DVD people, the kind of border drug sellers, and some border traffickers, and saying, if you want to do your illegal business, you've got to pay us for protection. So it starts off like that. By the early 2000s, they're doing it with legal businesses. So a lot of the violence we see is not necessarily about the trafficking of drugs. It's about controlling protection of the trafficking of drugs and protection of a whole myriad of licit and illicit businesses, right? So one thing that I do, and maybe I could explain this earlier. So I do a lot of legal work, of expert witness work for people who are fleeing very violent places in Mexico. Now, my assumption when I first started this is I'll be doing loads of this from Ciudad Juarez, Tijuana, and Sinaloa, the kind of drug capitals of Mexico, right? I'm not. I do it from Guanajuato. I do it from Zacatecas, basically places, Morelos, Puebla, places that aren't necessarily kind of capitals of drug trafficking, but they're places where so-called cartels, or at least self-declared cartels, which are basically just mafia groups, have moved in and have told the local tortilla seller, you've got to pay us or we're going to kill you and your family. And that's why these people are running. You know, they're not drug traffickers. You know, they're not involved in the business. They're normally involved in relatively boring, licit businesses that are now being shaken down. So there often, you know, the drug trade gets confused with this other kind of criminal war that is going on.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, this is something that Yon Grillo talks about in Gangster Warlords, in particular with the Mara Salvatrucha and the Barrio 18 in Central America, that a lot of it is just about kind of taking money from people and calling, and you know, like a protection racket. You say, I know a police officer down in El Salvador who was murdered a few years ago as a result of that, basically, and that was just you know, not even drugs weren't even involved at the time.
No, I mean, one of the things that I think that's kind of interesting, I don't think we really have got the political science tools to understand quite what is happening. So you notice there that a policeman got killed. Many policemen, I think last year I found it in Guanajuato, 93 policemen were killed. Oh, right? It has the, I mean, that's an extraordinary number in Guanajuato, in a place that I'm sure you and me in the 1990s knew it had mummies, very hard, you know, Catholics, and occasional petroleum refineries, right, and leather goods. Those are the things I knew about Guanajuato. Now it's the most murderous. It has no drugs. No one grows any drugs in Guanajuato. It has a bit of a market for meth in Leon, but it has the highest murder rate in Mexico, and it's over kidnapping, extortion, and stealing petroleum, and basically protecting petroleum lines and eking petrol out of it. That's what's causing the death. So I was thinking about, we don't really have the kind of political science tools to understand this, because on one hand, you have a state which is effectively trying to extract taxes from illicit businesses, right? And in Latin America, it's often done this via the police, right? So there are tax inspectors, but there's also police forces that have effectively extorted legal businesses in order to pay their own wages for decades, right? I mean, we know this. We've all been shaken down by a policeman, right? We've all had to play a mordida, right? A bribe.
Yeah.
So that in a way is a form of extortion, right? It's kind of raw taxation. I'll protect you if you pay me a bit of cash. So what the cartel, what the gangs, the cartels, the criminal groups, the maras are doing is they're moving in and effectively taking that aspect of the state, the kind of tax collecting and the kind of informal tax collecting aspect of the state, and they're taking that over. And they're either ally with the local police force, and basically, I mean, you know, Juarez, late 1990s, the police was called La Linea, and it was the Juarez cartel's armed gang, right? So they either ally with the local police or you kill the local police and you start extorting those mordidas yourself. So I think that's kind of what's going on. So a lot of the violence emerges weirdly from the process of Mexican state formation.
That's a really important aspect to this, that I think even though Narcos got a lot wrong, you see kind of the naivete of Kiki Camarena and many other DEA agents when they go down there, where they think, well, I'm working with the Mexican police, but at the same time, they know that they can't really trust them. And the fact is, that shows that a lot of these criminal organizations come from the fact that the PRI was essentially a criminal organization in a lot of ways too. Can you talk about the PRI's role in all of this?
I mean, I think the PRI, I mean, it's difficult to kind of separate the PRI, the government, the state. I mean, the state effectively, I think, came to a conclusion sometime in the 1920s that it had two options. One, it could go after drug dealers, it could put them all away, and it would cause an enormous amount of ill feeling, it would destabilize the North, or it could tacitly allow local politicians to shake down and extort the drug industry and basically survive with that money. Now, this is why I have a slight problem with thinking of the PRI or these local governors or these local politicians. We use the term corruption, which is a kind of morally loaded term.
Yeah.
Often these groups were taking, corruption is effectively using public money, your, my taxes, and using it and putting it in your private bank account. That's the classic political science definition of corruption. This is not corruption. This isn't public money. It's private money, drug dealers' money, and you're using it. Yes, some of it you use to buy a flashy car, but also you're using some of it, and I had incidents of this in the 30s and 40s of building schools, building roads, right? And even in the 60s and 70s, it's kind of unpalatable for a liberal like me, but they're basically, they're arming the army, and they're arming the police, and they're arming the Secret Service with this money. Now, these people they're less groovy than school teachers in 1930s Ciudad Juarez, right? But they're basically doing the state's job. It just happens to be the state's job is killing leftists in this period. So you're right in saying that you know, the PRI kind of acts like a mafia extortion, or part of the state acts like a kind of mafia, basically, after like an extortionist gang. Yeah, so I think that is true. But as I say, I'm not sure that kind of corruption is a very morally loaded term, which I'm not sure entirely explains what's going on. I mean, there was this amazing interview, and I think I put it in the book. If I don't, I should have. There's an amazing interview by a guy called Gonzalez Calderoni, who actually turns up in Narcos. He turns up. Sure. Yeah, he's right.
PJF officer.
Yeah, he's a PJ officer, right? And he takes down some of Mexico's most notorious drug dealers, but he also takes a lot of money for them. But then he does a runner to America in 2001, I think. I think he's being prosecuted. No, must have been 1996, 97, because he's running away. He's running away from the government. And he's kind of said, you know, they're corrupt. They made me do bad things. And he does this interview with PBS that you can actually still see. I don't know if you've ever listened to it. It's kind of amazing. And he says effectively, yeah, you want us to be like good policemen. You want us not to be corrupt. You didn't give us any money to do this. So what do? We shake down some drug dealers. We get uniforms, we get guns, we get a wage. And we take down some other drug dealers, which the gringos want us to do. So this is effectively our job, is basically deciding which drug dealers we're going to shake down and actually, support this bit of the state, the police bit, and then take down the other drug dealers that the gringos are really pressuring us to do. And that's what the police do.
And of course, Calderoni was then killed.
He was. I mean, whether he was killed he's an absolutely fascinating character that goes entirely, and I didn't really have time to kind of deal with him. I kind of mentioned him in passing a couple of times, but he's a fascinating character. I mean, he's head of the PGF, but as far as I can make out, he's head of the PGF, being the federal cops, the biggest police organization. He's a precursor to the guy who's currently in court in New York, Garcia Luna, who was also a very similar character, massively corrupt, but also quite a good police officer. I mean, in terms of, he did the gringos' bidding, right? He arrested the right people, but he was also massively corrupt and protected another group of people. So, but you're right, Gonzalez Calderoni, he's a cop, a local cop, really low down local cop in the early 1980s. He goes to school with the eventual head of the Gulf cartel, a guy called Garcia Abreu. He kind of grows up on the kind of Matamoros, Nuevo Laredo border area, and really uses his connections to the drug dealers to build up his credit in the PJF, because he goes and uses them as informers against other drug dealers, right? So he's a classic guy who builds his career on basically knowing, taking money from certain drug dealers to take out others.
Yeah, I think it's an important point you're making about this loaded word, corruption. I remember I was showing the first scene of Traffic to my students, and it really is showing something that was kind of realistic, with the former head of, the former drug czar of Mexico being portrayed on the screen there with a different name. But the students use the word corruption too. And I thought, well, actually, this is kind of the result of the drug war policies that have been put into place, the certification process in part of the United States, but also responding, the pressures on the part of the Mexican state to respond to the murder of Camarena, as well as the drugs coming across the border, going back to Operation Intercept in 1969 and Condor. But before that, it would have been kind of more like, and in the United States, pharmaceutical companies pay more money to politicians for their campaigns than any other industry. And they have to do that because large amounts of people are dying from their drugs. And so it almost seems like that's what Mexico had before the United States started to impose these laws. Would you agree with that, or maybe find some more nuance in that?
No, this is a really, really good analogy. I mean, corruption is, as I say, a really moral. We have no way to measure corruption. This is what always. I mean, when I'm up in front of judges and they go, "You say Mexico is kind of corrupt," and I go, "Well, yes, I do." And they go, "Well, by what measure?" There is no way. The only way we measure corruption is basically, there is a perception of. There are a series of perception of corruption indices where they go round businessmen. Well, I'm not sure of the best people to judge this kind of thing, and say what place is corrupt and what isn't. And New Zealand comes top and Mexico comes at the bottom, right? So this is basically, it is a Western way of doing business. I suppose the other thing that I wanted to bring out in the book, and I hope I did a little bit, was this corruption is not kind of baked in necessarily to Mexico. That this stuff goes on in America. And as soon as you have relatively underfunded drug policing, then you're going to get people who are on the take, who basically let some people off to take other people out. Now, during the 1960s, and this it didn't really kind of surface as much as it could, they believed somewhere in the region of a third of Anslinger's FBN were on the take from the French connection, right? A third of all the agents. The BNDD, which succeeds the FBN, it only survives 5 years after they find, there is some evidence that I present in the book that Miles Ambrose, who is head of BNDD, is involved himself in or at least allowing certain drug traffickers off. there's also quite heavy evidence that the mafia have managed to penetrate the BNDD during the early 1970s. And the DEA itself is absolutely full of corruption scandals that are buried incredibly. I mean, one thing that the DEA is very, very good at is knowing how to play the media and knowing how to bury these corruption scandals. I mean, perhaps the most famous in the period that I talked about was in the 1970s, with a guy called Sante Barrio, who explicitly took money from drug dealers and took coke, I think, from drug dealers, and then and looked the other way, right? And he died, and I shit you not, he was arrested and then died choking on a peanut sandwich because of a nut allergy he didn't know he had. The doctor who looked at him first said he's been strychnine poisoned. Then another doctor looked at him and said, no, that's not true. And I tried to FOIA his DEA record, and I got back one slip of paper that says this guy, he was six years in the DEA, 5 years in the BNDD, and in the FBN. There is no record of this agent. Which is just nonsense, right? So no, this kind of corruption, you know, or these kind of rackets pervade anywhere that sells drugs, right? All that's happened really in the last 2 decades in America is that rather than having an informal extortion racket, police departments in America have a formal extortion racket, right? Effectively, if you bust a drug dealer in most of the United States, you can take all his property and you can take all his cars and you can distribute it among the police, right? I mean, during the Ferguson riots 2 years ago now.
A little for
more than 2. They did a bit long investigation into it, and they found out, yes, the police department was racist, but the real problem with the police department was that it was shaking down low-level drug dealers and taking vast amounts of property from them. That's what was going on. But they were doing it it was basically legal. So anyway, so that's my rant over.
Right, and that kind of the mentality that we have in the United States is, well, that doesn't happen here. And if there's an individual case where it happens, then it can be kind of explained away as some bad apples. But you see lots of these bad apples around, and there is a legal process to do it. There's where basically confidential informants are given kind of a pass, right? You're allowed to deal drugs still as long as you're passing information to me. And this is one of those examples, I think, of how sometimes it occurs to me, like with the case of Barry Seal. Barry Seal was authorized to go ahead and keep dealing drugs as long as he was essentially, and they're not emphasizing that, but they're saying take pictures of the guys that are dealing drugs with you. And it occurred to me with that picture with him and Pablo Escobar and the Nicaraguans that was so famous that Reagan used. Imagine if that was any other crime. Imagine if he was robbing a bank or committing a murder or something worse along with somebody else. We wouldn't look at Barry Seal as a hero who's helping provide information. Why is it okay for a drug dealer to keep doing that, but the guy next to him goes to jail?
Yeah, well, actually, the guy next to him gets shot, right? It's Pablo Escobar by US-backed, military. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is something that these lines, these are really arbitrary. Well, I mean, they're not entirely arbitrary, are they? I mean, they're mostly drawn on the side of white people seem to get a pass on this. Americans get a pass over other foreigners. Down in Mexico, these lines are somewhat arbitrarily drawn between traffickers, who you ally with and who you go against, who you use as an informant and who you decide to take out. I mean, there's lots of it's something I'm considering doing for my next book, is actually attempting to do a kind of history of the DEA and try to look at some of their kind of major criminal, some of their kind of, major takedowns of major kingpins, and kind of worked out what were the actual human costs of these, which are not really treated particularly, or the human cost is seen entirely as to be, it's blamed on the drug traffickers.
Yeah, exactly. These are bad people. It's just too easy to explain it that way. And it occurred to me reading your book. And I should say too, I wanted to kind of paint the picture for the audience of how I came across your book. I hadn't heard about it ahead of time, but I was actually in Columbus, Ohio, 3 hours north of us, in a pretty famous bookstore in Germantown area, thousands of books around. And then your book was right there called The Dope. And I just picked it up and started reading it at that point. And it was really, it was the first time I'd seen kind of this long-term history. And it occurred to me almost right away that what you're doing for the Mexican drug war is something similar to what Peter Andreas did for in Smuggler Nation, where he's looking back, far back into the past and showing how we've tried this over and over and over again, and how these past examples of traffickers, whatever it might be, in his case, he's looking at all kinds of different substances, not just drugs, obviously alcohol and prostitution and condoms and cotton and sugar, etc. And in a way, you're doing the same thing too, to kind of show us that we've already been trying this for a long time in a variety of different ways, and that it's actually getting worse right now. It's much worse the more we fight against it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that and kind of, I mean, Andres is a really influential person, and that book was particularly influential for me. In actual fact, I'm glad you brought it up. It's kind of what I was trying to do, so I'm really glad that you brought that. I'm really chuffed with that particular parallel. So yeah, I mean, you're right. We're now trying to do it. We tried to do it when we had tariffs on all stuff that went between borders, right? We tried to do it in the 1960s and the 70s when it was actually quite difficult to move anything between the US and Mexico, but we still managed to smuggle loads. Well, as soon as you open up the borders, to NAFTA, and then you're still trying to stop drugs and stop people and stop other kind of untaxed objects. I mean, it is completely impossible. I mean, there is as I say, kind of influenced by Peter Andreas, but there's a wonderful section in his first book on kind of NAFTA and the drug trade. And he talks about talking to police and DEA down on the border in about 1993. And they're all saying, all the drug dealers are getting ready. They're all buying these warehouses in like Laredo, basically whenever they know there's going to be a massive road full of NAFTA traffic. And they've got business people in there who are explaining to them the new rules of NAFTA, what's going to get checked, what's not going to get checked, what's going to still be taxed, what's not going to be taxed. And they're working out, well, where do we put the coke, right? I mean, they are savvy to these kind of business changes. And you're right, it's completely impossible. Now you have a liberalized trade to do this, and kind of even more pointless than before.
Yeah, the people, if they go, I did a border trip 2 years ago and basically went between El Paso, Juarez, all the way down to San Ysidro, Tijuana, and crossed over all the major checkpoints. And you get the sense that there's more security there, but because of the permissibility of NAFTA, there's more vehicles that could come across. Therefore, those are really the areas. It's not the wall that is necessary, and the walls are there. But I mean, people aren't crossing over those walls. They're legally being able to transport the drugs and the people through those 46 legal checkpoints. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's where the vast majority. I think, I mean, there's another brilliant, and he's great with the statistic, is Andreas, but he's got this wonderful statistic where I think he works out was 18 million crossings in 1995, and the amount of coke needed to suffice America's appetite was 13 trucks.
Wow.
Right, that's 13 out of 18 million. You ain't gonna, I mean, that's not even a needle in a haystack.
Yeah. That's such an important point. Yeah. And the level of violence that's happening in those border towns in particular is connected to the protection rackets, right? Where you have to have, anybody who could threaten you with being extradited to the United States, or probably worse, being sent to a Mexican prison and not knowing what your fate would be. It just makes sense that people are going to use violence to try and stop that. And we can dislike that all we want, but that doesn't make the problem go away.
Yeah, I mean that's where these protection rackets got really kind of violent, and I suppose got privatized in the mid 1990s. So this is dealt with in a very good book, and I've just by, is it Sandra Lay and Guillermo Trejo. They've just, it's a very good book. So basically explains that in the up to the 1990s, the local and kind of federal cops controlled those border routes. During the 1990s, it's the border states that democratize, i.e. the PAN starts to win. Now, at this point, the cartels kind of go rogue, right? They go independent. Plus, they're getting absolutely tons of money from the coke trade, right? So previously, they earned quite a lot from heroin and marijuana, but nothing like the coke trade, right? I think they worked out that the coke trade basically puts a 0 on their profits, right? So now, the border towns are run by the PAN that has no idea what it's doing, frankly, and it's not used to running these protection rackets, right? Occasionally, it kind of tries its hand at it. It tries to bring in new cops. Some of them successfully make alliances with these new cartels. Other of them don't. So basically, yeah, the 1990s is where these cartels attempt to take over the previously state-run protection rackets. And once they start to do this, they start to expand out and say, well, we're not just going to do, we're not going to just do a protection racket of drugs. We'll also do everything else that gets crossed over this border. So human trafficking, stolen cars, prostitution, pretty much everything they take over. So I was tracing, you can trace it in the Ciudad Juarez and the Tijuana newspapers of the mid 1990s. They suddenly the crime journalists are going, well, we've just found 10 bodies in some kind of out of town, unused lot or kind of building site. What the hell is going on? And it slowly kind of gets out. These are people who are not paying the cartels the money to go through. Now, in this period, they're killing about one person a day, more or less, in Tijuana, one person a day in Juarez. But you can see that really increases by the early 2000s.
Yeah, right. In the late 1990s, early 2000s, the story was really more about the femicide, and then it starts to be really, and that was bad enough. But then, as Molly Malloy pointed out, though, too, that there were still a lot more men being murdered at that time, and that especially 2007, 8, 9, 10, like Julian Cardona mentions, that's just it's thousands of bodies at a time. I got a chance to speak to him when I was down there in 2019, and
he's lovely, isn't he?
Yeah, definitely. I was really lucky.
I did.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, he's poor. He was passed away very sadly in the last year. Did you know that?
No, I didn't know that. I guess that's why last time I wrote to him, I didn't hear a response. I didn't know that.
No, he's very sadly, I think, passed away maybe last year. I mean, a lot of people have passed away in the last year, but yeah, I think so. Very sadly, we met him when we were in Juarez doing this research, and he was such a kind and fascinating man, and talked a lot about that era as when it all kind of ramped up a level.
Wow. So I wonder, gosh, when did you meet with him? Then what year?
2018.
18?
17 maybe.
Okay. Yeah, it was.
Yeah.
June 19 for me, and he looked okay. I guess the thing that he pointed out to me is that something that is so important for us to understand in the United States too, and I'm sure he probably told you this too, that there's just there's such a small amount of investigation of each murder in Mexico, and there's really no way of knowing if you can trust the investigation anyway. And so it's so when we say that corruption is a bad word, because it's just that injustice is taking place so much, and lack of accountability, lack of trust, but also it's very possible that a huge amount of the murders in Juarez were carried out actually by the military and the police, and it's not just the cartels.
Yeah, I think that. I mean, and the line between the two is so slim anyway. I mean, so when the Sinaloa cartel rolls into Ciudad Juarez in 2007, right? It doesn't kill drug traffickers. It goes and puts a notice on there's a statue of a policeman, kind of to the unknown policeman of Juarez, right? And it's meant to be a kind of noble thing. And they just put a notice on it going, yeah, we're coming after the Juarez cartel. And what we mean by that are these policemen.
Yeah.
right? And then just start killing members of the local police who are effectively also the Juarez police. And you bring up Molly Malloy, and you're absolutely right. There's that extraordinary kind of biography of a hitman, of Sicario, who I mean, so I'm not. There is some controversy over quite how truthful it is, but it's an extraordinary piece of work and somewhat believable. And he's a cartel mule. And then they say, okay, you know, you can seem to be able to cope with the violence. We need to train you. So what does they do? They send him to become a member of the local police. Why? Because you get trained in how to use guns, and you can go to the US and get trained how to use guns. And then you come back, and he's at the training program for the local cops, and he looks around, and everyone else is a mule for the Juarez cartel. It's like a quarter of all the cops he already knows from his job in the cartel. So yeah, no, I mean, one thing that it's also made me think, this whole book really and this whole project, was how little we really understand the police and policing in Mexico. I mean, I've been banging on about the police for quite a lot of this interview, but it is something that is I think broad, you know, almost entirely unknown. There is, interestingly, a new book that is just about to come out with UC by a criminologist called Fondevila and I believe a lawyer, who do a history of the Mexico City police from the 20s through to the 60s, which sounds really interesting, because we have nothing like that, right? Yeah. We have no understanding of really how the police worked and why these injustices grew.
Oh gosh, I really look forward to reading that. Well, and going back to that interview you're talking about, Room 164, I think it's called, based on the book, right, Sicario. The detail he provides when he draws in that book about the kinds of training that they had, and in marksmanship and detention and surveillance too, that just, I mean, the fact that the cartels are so good at that too shows that they've got this institutional knowledge that must come from the police forces. Well, and of course we know a lot of the former cartel members were DFS agents too, and or at least were given badges for that too, and some of them were state police, like Miguel Angel Felix Gallardo. And so that kind of institutional knowledge is very different than what we see up here. You don't see that many former police officers that are actually involved in running gangs in the United States, although they could be involved in extortion, certainly. But you saw that in Prohibition, right? In Prohibition, you had, I think his name was Roy Olmsted, a lieutenant in the Seattle Police Department, who immediately took off his uniform when Prohibition went into effect and became a big rum runner up in the Northwest.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, it comes down really, really raw, in a raw sense, to money, right? I mean, one thing that we know that the police and the DEA get are really, really nice pensions at a relatively nice age. Now, pretty much the only way you can lose that pension is getting involved in the drug trade. Yeah. Right, or getting involved in some kind of criminal activity. So they don't, right? So effectively they are paid off not to do that. Well, Mexican police don't get that pension, so they go straight into the thing that they know, with all the people that they know. Definitely. And people probably owe them something for letting them off.
So we've had an hour to talk about this approximately, and I've really enjoyed this. The last image I wanted to kind of throw at you and to the audience too is that I like to imagine your book as essentially showing that there's a line between El Chapo Guzman and tens of thousands of others in the past that go back over a century in Mexican history, who police officers have either tried to capture or they have captured or killed, and yet each time they declared success. And so they declare success, and then somebody else comes along and replaces them. So can you explain maybe briefly, what do you think is, I mean, is that an accurate way of portraying this? Do they just keep arresting their way out of it?
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. Never before has a war lasted, 100 odd years, since 1914 when they've banned it. And every year we're told there was an extraordinary victory, and yet overdoses go up. You're at 100,000 overdoses. I mean, that's just breathtaking this year. Yeah. The amount of drugs that people are taking, the amount of drugs going over the border, just going up and up. And yet every day, we're continually sold this lie that there's a victory, and that by taking out a particular capo or some kind of spurious cartel that doesn't really exist, then that's the victory that's going to finally stop America taking crack or coke or fentanyl or heroin or whatever it is this month. And it won't, because it's got nothing to do with supply.
Yeah. Wow. And it's a sad history. And hopefully by reading this type of history, future political entities will make different decisions. So you can see that there are some bright spots around the world, like Uruguay and Canada and in some European places too. But then there are backlashes against it too, where people just feel like, well, we got to be tough on crime, and that politically that sells, unfortunately, at least in the United States.
No, certainly. And I mean, also in Britain has really, really harsh laws on drugs. And really stupid, really, in some ways, much stupider than even American federal laws on drugs. So no, I mean, it's I know you probably bring out the Philippines, which has ludicrous laws, but yeah, there are plenty of these places. Thailand as well, Indonesia, Singapore. I mean, all these places have. China, Russia.
Oh, sure.
The authoritarian regimes love a drug law because it's a really easy way to put a kind of slightly unwanted underclass in jail.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. This is a big history approach too. There's a lot more to it than just my uncle is addicted to drugs. That's a lot of the story. Well, my uncle's addicted to drugs, my son is, and so I want to stop that from happening. I'm going to put harsher laws in place. So. Well, I really encourage everybody to go ahead and check out Benjamin T. Smith's The Dope. Great book, and look forward to reading your future work as well, especially if you do that project on the DEA. That would be excellent. And cool. Thanks so much for talking to us today.
It was a real pleasure, Chris, and I'm sorry I don't have more time because I really was enjoying that. And
no problem. Me too.
Have a good one.
All right, you too. All right, let's talk again sometime soon.
Cool.
Take care.